How to avoid Mercedes transmission problems. That's the topic of today's video. Hello, my name is Elvin and welcome to Accent on Cars. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Mercedes transmissions and how to avoid problems, how to maintain them, how to service them, and how to make sure they never fail. This video applies to pretty much any Mercedes with the 5-speed and 7-speed transmissions. In other words, any Mercedes manufactured between 2003 and 2017 model years. But before we talk about failures and common issues and how to avoid them, it's important to understand the transmission itself. So Mercedes-Benz 5-speed transmission, trademarked as 5G Tronic, was produced in early 2000s. I believe it debuted in the E-Class particularly, it debuted in the W211 in 2003, and it was produced all the way until 2007. In 2007, Mercedes moved on to their next generation of their transmission lines, trademarked as 7G Tronic. 7G Tronic was the 5th generation of Mercedes transmission lineups. The 7-speed transmission was used in pretty much everything, starting from top of the line S-Class all the way down to C-Class. The 7G Mercedes transmission has 7 forward gears and 2 reverse gears, created by 2 simple set of planetary gears. It has 4 multi-disc brakes and 3 multi-disc clutches, giving it the ability to drop multiple gears in a single downshift. In 2010, 7G Tronic Plus, the transmission was introduced, making it even better, even more sturdier, and giving it the ability to work with modern-day torquey turbo engines. Okay, now I'll give you a rundown of the common problems and common issues with 7G and 5G transmissions, and then I'll explain how do you know you have problems, what are the symptoms of problems, and what you can do to avoid them. So it's very rare for these transmissions to have actual internal failures, like hardware related failures. I would say maybe that happens in 10 to 15% of the time, and usually happens in very high mileage, severely ignored maintenance-wise transmissions. So most problems, most common failure points are electronics related. The second least common problem is actually flywheel related. The 5G and 7G transmissions have computer modules that control when the transmission should shift. We call them a conductor plate. The transmission has a pan underneath with numerous number of passages for the oil to flow through. We call that a valve body, and the valve body has a conductor plate attached to it. That's the brain, that's the major chip of your transmission. That's what controls when to shift, how many gears to drop, and so forth. And that computer set, the valve body with the solenoids on it and with the computer on it, sits inside your transmission. It's always covered in fluid, in the transmission fluid. And unfortunately, over time, something happens and those electronics fail. Conductor plate failures are twofold. Sometimes the whole conductor plate needs to be replaced, or the solenoids on it go bad and they can be swapped individually to save you a lot of time and money. And the other common issue is the speed sensor failure. That's what I had on mine. I'll talk more about that failure later, how much it was for me to fix it and what was the fix. So, but there's a sensor that's called speed sensor that kind of senses how fast the car goes and decides which gear that the transmission should be in. That's another failure point. So now it's important to know, how do you actually know that you have any symptoms of failure? The major thing you should know is that both 5G and 7G transmissions should be buttery smooth. You should almost not feel how it shifts, and if it operates like that, you know you have a healthy and great transmission. If there is any jerks or bangs at downshifts, upshifts, especially when going downhill and uphill, those are early signs for transmission issues. And if you experience any of that, it's time to look into it. Do not let it sit, because it's going to get worse from there. So if you're in the market for any Mercedes 2003 all the way 2017, 18 with the 5G and 7G transmission, and you want to make sure your transmission is operating well before buying the car, make sure that the car is warmed up all the way. And I mean, by the way, I don't mean the oil is warmed up, I mean the transmission, and it usually takes longer for the transmission to reach the operating temperature than for the engine. So if the engine is at just reached the operating temperature, drive it for a little more, make sure the transmission has warmed up all the way, then park it, and then move it from park to drive to reverse. There should be very minimum movement. As you shift gears from park to drive, from drive to reverse, if you feel like the car is kind of moving under you, it might be a sign of big failure. Another thing, put it in comfort, drive it normally, do not floor it, do not drive it very spiritedly, and try to go uphill and downhill. Slow down before the uphill or downhill, so the transmission kind of upshifts or downshifts. That should be butter smooth. If you feel like it's banging, that's not good. All right, so we just talked about the transmission, what it is. We talked about common issues and how do you know that you have some of the problems. Now let's talk about what you can do to avoid those problems. All right, now let's talk about maintenance and preventive maintenance and things you can do to avoid the problems I just described earlier. The first thing and the most obvious one is the transmission service. And by that I mean that you have to replace your transmission fluid every 40,000 miles. If you have early iteration of 5G or 7G transmissions. 40,000 miles or 60,000 kilometers should be the interval at which you change your transmission fluid. If you have 2010 plus 7G transmission, then you have a different type of fluid, the blue fluid. And the fluid in the early iterations of 5G and 7G transmissions is usually like it has a pink color to it. And later year models, 2010 plus, 7G Tronic plus, the updated version of the 7G transmission uses blue fluid. Service interval at those is 70,000 miles. So every 70,000 miles instead of 40,000 miles in non-AMG variant. And that would be a good time to inspect if you have any metal shavings inside the transmission. Hopefully not. If yes, then you should look further into like hardware or flywheel related failures. But those are rare if the transmission is serviced regularly. But is that enough? If you service your transmission every 40,000 miles, does that guarantee that you will have no failures? Unfortunately, it doesn't. And like I said earlier, my transmission was actually serviced at 40,000 miles. At about 50,000 miles, shortly after the first transmission service, I had electronics failure. Like I described earlier, most of the failures associated with 7G transmission, especially early ones, are electronics related. So I had speed sensor failure. And speed sensor failure, at least in 2007 model year, you cannot just replace the conductor plate. I mean, you technically could, but a lot of mechanics told me that they recommend against it because I have like what they call like VGS1 version of the chipset. So they recommended that I change the valve body and the conductor plate altogether. And that costed me about $2,500 parts and labor. And that came with 3-year warranty. Knock on the wood, I haven't had any problems since then. If you are lucky, you may be able to just, replace the conductor plate or the solenoids on it, or there are even companies out there, you can find them on eBay, etc. You can ship out your conductor plate. They'll replace, I guess, like failed electronic units, ship it back to you. I just don't know how reliable that repair is gonna be. I can't tell you. So if you are someone who can service their transmission themselves, definitely I would say start with easy things first. Try to replace just the conductor plate. And if it fixes your problem, great. If it goes bad, like a year later, because you are gonna do labor yourself, that's not a big issue. But if you are hiring someone to do the job and paying $2,500, $3,000, I would just recommend that if you have any failures, just to be safe, you should replace conductor plate and valve body together. All right, tip number 2 for you guys is to keep your hands off of the shifter. Seriously, I know a lot of people like shifting all the time, left and right in the traffic. These transmissions do not like that. Just put it in automatic, in comfort or sport, depending on the traffic, and let the computer do its job. There is no need to really shift it all the time. This is especially true about stop and go traffic or driving in the city. When you're driving normally, you are cruising, let it be, let it change, let it do its own thing. If you want to shift manually, put it in manual mode. At least the AMG variants have the manual mode. Non-AMGs do not have it. They only have like comfort and sport, in which case you should not be constantly shifting it. Now, I'm not saying you should never do it. If you are driving spiritedly, you are on a highway, you want to go through the gears of yourself, rev it all the way, bang, 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 upshift, downshift, absolutely do that. Enjoy these cars. That's what these cars are for. But there is no reason, there is no valid reason for you to constantly be shifting it manually. These transmissions do not like that. And on a similar note, I'm gonna give you tip number 3. I know all of us, most of us Mercedes owners, when we are in the car, we sit like this, laid back, one hand over here, one hand on the steering wheel, and we're driving around, looking at the peasants, and looking for BMW M owners so that we can humiliate them. When doing that, a lot of people have their right hand on the shifter all the time. Again, this shifter is not your girlfriend's leg. Keep your hands off of it. There's no need for holding your hand on the shifter. Why? Because the weight of your hand And the micro movements as the car goes over the bumps puts a lot of strain onto the shifter. Now, this shifter is not directly connected to the transmission. This is just a basically a computer module. This is shift by wire, but there's a little plasticky kind of like housing in here that's holding this shifter in place. And if you constantly keep your hands on the shifter, the weight of your hand and micro movements over time going to cause excessive wear to that plastic housing that keeps everything in place. And that's the reason why every once in a while you will see people will say, oh, my kind of like shifter housing or computer here has gone bad, I need to replace it. Of course, keep your hands to yourself. Again, this is not a beautiful girl for you to keep your hands on her legs. This is a shifter. And if you follow all the tips I shared in this video, guys, then you should be good. These transmissions are generally bulletproof, will serve you a long time. They might have hiccups here and there, but generally these transmissions will outlast your engine and the rest of the car. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video, guys, and found it useful. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe for Mercedes content. I'll see you in the future episodes.